Yes, and we are live. Hello, everyone. Just give it a few more seconds for some people to arrive, and then we'll start. All right, there are already quite some people here, many people arriving. So it's time to start. Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. First of all, don't worry. Only the speakers are visible. We have 5 speakers today, including myself, and you're also automatically muted. If you want to participate in this event, share your reactions or ask a question, please use the tabs on the bottom right where you find the tab polls, question, and chat. And then you can interact with us. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Leo. I'm the host and moderator here today, and I'm also one of the founders of Amsterdam Standard. And we are a development partner for many tech companies in the Netherlands. And today we organize this session together with De Roos Advocaten and our sister company Global Orange. And we're very excited about this, and I believe that we have a lot of very relevant and interesting information for you. So first of all, thank you for being here. Let me quickly tell you why we organized this webinar today. Since the launch of ChatGPT 3 last year in November, we have seen an explosion of AI tools, and especially ChatGPT itself showed that the AI revolution is really happening right now. And within our company, many people have been experimenting with ChatGPT since the first days. And we know that AI will change our profession as developers drastically in the next few years. Some people think it will steal their jobs. We don't think so. We like to embrace everything that's going on in this new technology, and we want to use it in our advantage. But all that experimenting with ChatGPT also immediately triggered many questions. For example, can we just copy paste our own or our client's code to ChatGPT? And who owns the output of Copilot AI, for example, a tool that we will also discuss today? And what will happen with my data if I use it there? Will they, for example, use it to train their models? And those are all very relevant questions that we need to answer first before we can actually use these tools on production. And that is the reason why we organized this webinar today, together with 2 great subject matter experts from De Roos Advocaten and 2 very experienced people with a technical background from Global Orange and Amsterdam Standard. So first, let our speakers introduce themselves to you. So Laura, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you also for the very nice introduction. My name is Laura van Gijn. I am partner at De Roos Advocaten and I lead the IP section. I'm very happy to be here. ChatGPT, Copilot, very interesting subjects for us. Everyone's talking about it and well, lots of cool legal implications. My teammate Romee is also in this webinar. So Romee, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Romee Groenewold. I work with Laura in the IP department of De Roos Advocaten. Before starting as a lawyer at De Roos, I taught for a year at Utrecht University, where I also specialized in IP law. And I'm really excited to contribute to this seminar today for all of you. Over to you, Brecht.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brecht Bosker, Chief Technology Officer at Global Orange. I have around 20 years of experience in building digital products in a wide range of technologies, businesses, and types of use. And in the past couple of years, I've also gotten a deep understanding of various AI-related applications. And today I will also be looking at the practical use. Over to you, Stepan.
Yes, hi everyone. It's nice to be here. My name is Stepan Ceslik. I'm head of engineering at Amsterdam Standard. Into software development for more than 12 years, and I am a big AI fan. Over to you, Leo.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the introductions. So let me first tell you what you will learn today. Most of all, we'll show you how you can superpower your development teams with the 2 tools that we'll discuss today, ChatGPT and Copilot AI. Also, we'll tell you a little bit more about the do's, but also the don'ts of those AI tools, because they're not perfect yet. Of course, Laura and Romee will tell you all about the key legal implications of using these tools, and they will give you like a brief course of the basics of IP law, tell you about the future legislation that is coming up, and we'll explain you a little bit about the AI Act, where it's a proposal pending. What you will get today, you will receive afterwards in the upcoming days our white paper with more legal context about the topics that we discussed. Some of the parts that we discussed today can be very overwhelming, so you have some nice time to read it later on. A list with some legal essentials that you actually need to check before you start using these AI tools in your workflow, and an additional handy list of useful resources. Before we continue to Brecht, I first would like to ask you something. So maybe we can look at the polls tab on the bottom, where we have a question for you. So what concerns do you have? What concerns do you have about using AI like ChatGPT in your development process? Are you mostly concerned about security, data privacy, ethical considerations, potential bias, how to integrate it with your existing workflows and tools, or training and onboarding or team members, quality concerns, or maybe you don't have concerns at all? So you can add multiple answers if you want. You can just submit your vote right now. Yeah, so I see that 33% is mostly worried about security and data privacy, 21% about ethical considerations. So that's great. We have a lot of interesting content to share about that in this webinar, and we'll get back to that. Thank you for that. Brecht, can you maybe do a quick introduction about ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot AI?
Absolutely, Leo. So, welcome everyone. The topic we talk about today is all the buzz lately, generative AI technologies based on large language models, or LLMs as they're also known as. More specifically, these are models based on the generative pre-trained transformer, that's where the name GPT comes from, are especially powerful form of language models that can deliver extraordinary results by being designed to analyze natural language input and to respond in a way that mimics human interaction. These models work by having been constructed using huge amounts of human readable text and computer source code. For example, GPT-3, the most current one just before GPT-4 got released, on which both ChatGPT and Copilot are based, was trained on 500 billion input symbols. It's important to note, therefore, that since the model is based on symbols from the past, it's typically not very good at generating valid output for questions related to future events. That is, of course, or maybe even recent events. I would say that that's kind of obvious. To get a feeling for how these models work, it's probably best to think of them like the autocorrect suggestion you may know from your cell phone. A suggestion for next word is made based on what you've typed so far. These models, in principle, work in a very similar way, although they have a much larger knowledge base and the window of context that they look at is much larger. To get things going for this webinar, maybe some fun facts about ChatGPT and Copilot. One of them is ChatGPT has actually won a prestigious Japanese literature award with a poem. Copilot AI can support developers in multiple programming languages and even translate between various languages, meaning developers can be productive in a broader environment potentially. Copilot AI also has been known to generate hilarious coding suggestions. For example, if you type "make me a sandwich" into Copilot AI, it may suggest a code snippet that prints the phrase, "I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I can't do that," which is obviously a reference to Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. The picture I included here on the right is a reference to the technology finding its way into the legal systems. In this case, the Colombian judge Juan Manuel Padilla asked the AI tool how laws applied in case of an autistic boy's medical funding. Well, the ruling itself wasn't necessarily so controversial, but the fact that he included his conversation with ChatGPT was not only novel, but quite controversial. I'll now bridge to Laura to discuss the legal aspects of using these tools. Laura, up to you.
Thank you, Brecht. Yes, that is quite a scary example you referred to there, that Colombian judge. Well, let's discuss some IP basics first. We will later on also discuss some other legal aspects, but IP aspects, intellectual property law aspects are particularly relevant here. Some disclaimers to begin with. The subject matter is quite complex. We will keep it high level, but we must use the word probably a lot. So, well, then you can already get used to that. Next slide. Key takeaways of IP rights are, in the first place, that copyrights are primarily relevant for software. And that is interesting to know, because copyrights were in principle written for books, art, things like that. And at the moment that copyright came to life, all the legal experts in the world, or at least some legal experts, came together and they asked each other, how should we protect software? And they discussed whether it would be suitable for patent law, other types of intellectual property law, and in the end they decided it should be copyrights. So that is why we are basically looking at these types of intellectual property rights. Copyrights emerge at the moment of creation. So not only if you are writing a book or making a painting, at the moment that you are writing code, these copyrights emerge at that exact moment. No formality is required. Another important thing to know about copyrights is that, at least in the EU, the threshold for protection is rather low. So basically, any set of more or less creative choices will qualify for at least some level of copyright protection. This means basically that any line of self-created code shall in principle qualify for copyright protection within the EU. An interesting fact that will be relevant particularly in relation to ChatGPT and Copilot is that copyrights can only apply to works created by humans. And now it is interesting to look at the next slide. Perhaps you already know these pictures. These pictures are actually selfies made by the monkeys that you see. Very cool pictures. They became very famous. How did these pictures emerge? Well, these pictures were taken because a photographer, David Slater, left his cameras in the woods, and he also attached selfie-taking appliances in order to enable the monkeys to play with his cameras and also to make selfies. Well, they led to really cool pictures, and they were used by everyone, also without permission of David Slater. And he tried to prevent that because he said, hey, that's a violation of my copyright. It's not your picture, it's mine. In the end, this discussion ended up before a judge, and in the US, a court ruling provides that these pictures did not qualify for copyright protection because the pictures were taken by a monkey. So that is a, well, nice example to remember that copyrights only apply to works created by humans. It must be noted that some legal experts think otherwise about this, and that some exceptions might apply. But the main rule is important to remember. Well, over to you, Romee.
Thank you. Well, we're already on the right slide. I will talk you through some of the legal points that are relevant when using ChatGPT and Copilot. And at some point, I will focus on ChatGPT and Copilot will come back later. So an essential distinction that we need to make here is the distinction between input and output, where input shall in most cases be created by humans. It's the content that you put into the program, and output is machine generated. It's what the machine puts out after you have put in the input. Input shall often qualify for copyright protection because it is human generated. However, the machine generated output shall in principle not qualify for copyright protection unless specific circumstances apply, as we just saw in the example with the monkey selfie. So for example, when there's enough human involvement. And to go back to the example of the monkey selfie, the photographer tried to show that there was enough human creativity involved since he had set up the camera and the setting in a specific way. Output that is redacted by a human afterwards is also likely to qualify for at least some level of copyright protection. This is not surprising because, as we discussed, the threshold for copyright protection is rather low. So a small change could already establish that there's a sufficient human creativity involved to establish this copyright protection. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So focus on ChatGPT. Are there legal differences between the free and the paid version? From a legal point, no significant differences. You can see on the slide a few minor points where there are differences, but from a legal aspect, this doesn't matter. However, there is a difference between the API and the non-API version. This I will come back to later. We will take a little look at the applicable user terms, which apply to all OpenAI tools, excluding Copilot. So the first part you see here, some clauses that are saying users may not. And some interesting ones I find: users may not use the services in a way that infringes, misappropriates, or violates any person's rights. Also, IP rights fall within the scope of this article. For example, a copyright. And the last one, users may not represent that output from the services was human generated when it is not. So this clause imposes a certain level of transparency on their users. And then we can go to the next slide. Also a clause in the terms and conditions about the content. I will not read this whole article to you, but as we briefly discuss the main points in the next slide, but I will shortly look at what do we read here. We read a part that as between the parties and to the extent permitted by applicable law, you own all the input. So the human generated input you own. Subject to your compliance with these terms, OpenAI hereby assigns to you all its right, title, and interest in and to output. So this way you do not have to be afraid that ChatGPT will say, I helped with that output, it's partly mine. Here they say if you comply with the terms, they assign it to you. This means that you can use content for any purpose, including commercial purposes such as sale or publication. Also, the last thing we see in this clause is that if you comply with these terms, OpenAI may use content, so that is your input and your output, to provide and maintain the services, comply with applicable law, and enforce their policies. So here we see that OpenAI will use your content for those purposes, also your inputs. So after this brief overview with some of the legal guidelines when for using ChatGPT, it's a little summary of these rules, because I think that the clause for the non-legal people is maybe a bit too difficult to comprehend. So what did we see? ChatGPT users retain all rights to their input if applicable, so if it was your input. Also, OpenAI does not claim any rights to your output, it is yours. The user is free to use and exploit that output. And further, what did we see? You must be transparent that the output is machine generated. OpenAI says it will not use API content. So there is that difference that I was referring to. They will use non-API content to improve their services, but API content they will not use. And OpenAI may use content, so the non-API content, with regards to both input and output, to provide and maintain its services. So there we see an important difference. And then, after the summary and this brief overview, Stefan will now show you how to use ChatGPT when working with code and how to superpower your teams when doing so.
Yes, thank you. So as I said, I'm quite some time into software development, mostly as regular Python dev, later also as team lead and architect. One thing that all IT projects share in common is that there is always too much work and too little time to do so. So anything that can speed up your work or improve quality of the code, or preferably both, is highly appreciated. So I've prepared you 4 examples of how can you use ChatGPT to improve your workflow. But you must note one thing. AI, at least for now, is mostly effective in repetitive tasks, or ones that are common, like user account creation. Every service has it, so ChatGPT can give you a pretty good example how to do it. And these examples are ordered in kind of way that we're starting from the best cases and slowly go to more tricky ones. So let's dive into the first example. In this example, you can see that I'm asking ChatGPT to refactor following code, and this is a snippet from one of the projects. This is actually a working piece of code. And as I return, I have another piece of code that does the same thing, but in smaller amount of lines. It cuts out some stuff. I also have an explanation what was removed, what was replaced, and why. And as you can see, for free, I can have smaller code, and smaller code is always better because it contains less bugs. So for free, you have gain. At this step, when the response was generated, you can actually go into more interactive mode and ask for something more, maybe to add this values copy back if you need it for something, or extend the functionality in some way. So there might be some kind of dialogue into this improvement. But that's like simple case, because you have a code that's working, you get something else that should work the same. The second and third example is that are very common to case when your team inherits something from, inherits some code base that might be old, for example, or poorly maintained. So we can see I'm asking ChatGPT to write me some unit tests for following code. And it is not uncommon that in old code base, there is lots of code that is not tested in any way. And it's also a chore for developers to write these test cases, first because it's not enjoyable thing, and second, you need to first understand what this code is about to write proper test cases. It's not as repetitive as first example, so the answers you get from ChatGPT, you must verify, you must double check, but it's really good starting point for later refactor and code improvements. And ChatGPT actually parses the code for you and explains what's happening here, so you just a bit faster with that. Third example, connected, is to explain a piece of code that I'm pasting into the prompt. And as a result, I get detailed description what is happening in that particular function. So if you have a problem with understanding old code or something you inherited, it is pretty good way of trying out things and understanding what's happening inside. The result is also good starting point for documentation, right? So you can copy paste this to your team documentation, and everyone can gain something from it. Yes, and the example second and third are really good reason to improve your code quality, because it takes one excuse away from developers. It's not like it's acceptable to not give tests and documentation if it's so easy to do, right? And the fourth example, which is a bit tricky, is to write code from scratch. This is also example in model GPT-4, which is now available at paid version. So it takes a little more time to do because it's bigger. And here I'm asking to write a Python code to fetch forecasts for Krakow, from which I'm calling today. And as a result, I get pointed where should I ask for API key. It's openweathermap.org, which is great because I didn't know such service even existed in the first place. So if you're pitching a new idea, if you're trying to do something new, ChatGPT might trick you, but it's worth to try a few times asking for a few things and see what prototypes it will give you, because in the beginning of development, there's this creative stage. You need to find a way to do stuff. And ChatGPT can generate a lot of prototypes you can try out and see what's working, what not. This is actually pretty common example, asking for forecasts. So this code you can see is still generating. I can tell you already it's working out of the box. I tried this yesterday. All you need to do is replace your API key with what you get by the instruction from ChatGPT. So it's already working application, which is like very small, but still application, which is great by itself. You must remember, though, that if you're asking for something that is very innovative or not common to do, you will probably not get something that works out of the bat. Like if you try to ask for driver code for Moonlander, probably it's not something you could use safely in anything, but it can point you to the places where you can find your answers. So it's definitely worth trying out what ChatGPT can give you for new, fresh code and projects. Yes, and that's for short examples what ChatGPT can do. Now we need to go back to Earth, because all these examples have some legal implications we need to actually be aware of, but on these I'd like Romeo to elaborate more.
Yeah, before we switch to Romeo, there's two very interesting questions in the chat. So have you seen them?
Yes.
Okay. Will you address them, or shall I address them after your part?
You can address them.
Okay.
I'll fill you in where needed.
Okay.
So you can address them.
Yeah, but will you first discuss the legal implications?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And then we'll look at the questions. I'm sorry,
exactly.
guys.
I think that's the logical order. Yeah.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you. I'm sorry, guys. So putting code into ChatGPT or Copilot, which is not your own, that's a legal implication that we're going to look at right now. And I will discuss a couple of principles that are important when you're doing this. First of all, the author of a computer program is the rights holder to that program. So the person who wrote it, who wrote the computer program, made it. So what does it mean to be a rights holder? As a rights holder, you have the exclusive right to do or to authorize certain restricted acts. And then we see a little list. And one that's really important here when using ChatGPT or Copilot is the permanent or temporary reproduction of a computer program. Because when you're putting something in ChatGPT or in Copilot, that can be a temporary reproduction of that computer program, which is a restricted act. Then the third bullet forms the exception on the above mentioned restricted acts. This makes it possible for people who are not a rights holder to perform these restricted acts when the exception is applicable. So these are basically the three main rules that you need to remind in this concept. And then we're going to look at the examples that Stefan just spoke with us about. Can we go to the next slide? Perfect. So first we have I think we're starting with the first example, refactoring your own code. If the person who puts the input into the program is the right holder himself, you have the exclusive rights to perform those restricted acts that we just saw, such as the reproduction right. Thus, refactoring your own code is probably okay. As Laura already mentioned, we're going to use a little bit of probably, and we don't want to give you a green light on everything. Then the second example, writing test cases for someone else's code. So in this example, you yourself are not the owner of the code, which means you will need authorization to perform the restricted acts. Entering code in ChatGPT or Copilot, as we saw, is a form of temporary reproduction and therefore falls under the restricted acts. So not probably okay, you probably need authorization. Then the third example that Stefan spoke with us about was explaining, and there you see it, someone else's code. Again, you are not the owner of this code. You will need authorization to perform the restricted acts. Entering code into ChatGPT, entering code into Copilot is a form of temporary reproduction, falls under the restricted acts. And the last example, generating code from scratch is comparable with the first example. You yourself are the right holder, you're not using someone else's code, and therefore you have the exclusive right to perform these restricted acts that we just saw, such as the reproduction right. So, last but not least, probably okay. So, after this dive into ChatGPT and the legal implications when using it, Brecht will now tell you more about Copilot.
Shall I first address some?
questions?
Yeah, we can. I cannot do all of them, but I saw two that are relevant to discuss right now. So one very relevant question is: so we should not use as an input any data behind NDA agreements, right? Correct. That is a correct implication. And another very interesting question is: let's say I use ChatGPT to generate text on websites. After what percentage am I not prohibited anymore to tell the user that it's generated by AI? I think you probably meant, am I not prohibited anymore to pretend that I wrote it or that it would be human generated? That is a very relevant question because it's at this point very difficult to see whether something was generated by ChatGPT or not. Unfortunately, in terms of copyright law, there are no safe percentages. There's also this urban legend that 7 differences would be enough to prevent copyright infringements. There is no such rule. So hard to say, but relevant question.
Yes, I agree with that. And also I think we should remember that it's beneficial for everyone online to have some form of transparency. And you would expect the same from the other people online, the websites you visit, the text you read. And at some point we can trust these programs and it doesn't even matter if they are being used. But I think thinking of the greater good at it, the transparency is something that is a positive thing for everyone online.
Okay, the other 2 questions by Edwin and Daniel, will try to answer them in the Q&A session by the end of this webinar.
Perfect.
So we'll come back to that. All right, so let's move on to GitHub Copilot. Brecht, maybe you can say something about this.
Yes, thanks all. It's been quite insightful so far. I think we can skip to the next slide. I've also included 4 examples, some of them a bit related to what Stefan has been showing, but I also wanted to highlight 2 different angles where these technologies could lead to, and of course give it to the legal team to discuss the implications for a team, but also business at large. The first example will be also a creative process where you have a chore, some work to do. You need to generate. Can we just go back to the previous slide, please?
Great, yeah.
For 1 second. You want to generate code to solve a business problem. Previous slide, please. 1 second. Yeah, thank you. The second one could be you have a task at hand, you don't know how to solve a problem, and you just ask it to generate code, but hey, the code contains security issues. The third one actually can go really a long way. I will talk about that in a bit. Code with a bias, and in this case specifically a racial bias. And the fourth one, not to go out with the downer, will be showing a bit the implications of doing cross-language translations. And now, indeed, I would like to go to the next slide. So, first of all, let's say I'm tasked by the team to do something. Next slide, I will go in an example style. Let's say we're in need of creating beautiful PDFs. And as this briefing will show, I'm not a designer. But let's say we want to generate a snippet of Python code that generates a PDF file using A4 paper size with a nice header text in the top right corner of the page. And let's say wishing everyone a Happy New Year in Swedish. Why not? And to spice things up a little bit, has an orange-reddish line along the bottom of the page. So let's see how this goes. Next slide, please. I will now.
Yeah, you have to show the video.
I will share the video. So before we dive into it, I hope for me it's still a bit blurred. Yeah, there we go. So just pause it there for a second. This is the code editor I was using. On the top left, you see the input that you would normally use to code. The hash signs and the green text is comments. So those are not actual programming language, so human readable text was what you saw on the previous slide. Below that is a header of a Python function, and on the right you see the output of GitHub Copilot. At this point, it's synthesizing 7 out of 10 solutions, and you already see it came up with a couple of different suggestions. Just stopping there for a second, the one there where the cursor is at, it creates a report with a page size A4 that seems to check a box. It's suggesting to use Helvetica. Fine, no problem there. It says Gott Nytt År. That's a Swedish saying for Happy New Year. It does something with color and it draws a line. Okay, that seems fine so far, but let's see what it can do more. So scrolling down a little bit, I see a little bit of different code, roughly the same. It's apparently using a different library. That's fine. Hey, but we also have a suggestion for an empty function. That doesn't seem really useful. So let's see what else it can do. One of the things I noticed when using GitHub Copilot over the past period is that it's not very predictable in its behavior. Sometimes it generates useful suggestions, sometimes it generates completely useless suggestions like empty functions, sometimes plainly wrong. But the thing that struck me most was the fact that every time you invoke Copilot, the output may be different. So here on the right, you see actually it now also, it says God Jul and a Gott Nytt År. It even included Merry Christmas. So I didn't ask for that, but hey, it's creative. But actually, if I now wanted to have the previous suggestion, I lost it. I'll run it again to see what else it can do. So in a second, invoke it again. You see it starts synthesizing. And even if you don't read Python code, you will see from the structure that it is it's daydreaming a bit. So it's coming up with new suggestions all the time. So depending on the problem you have at hand, it may be a hit or miss. It may be very useful, but you really need to keep your wits about. So I'm just going to close this one for a second there. And let's go to the second example. So this, I would say I didn't test the code, but from my experience, I could say that would be a pretty nice leg up towards creating this beautiful PDF with a New Year's greeting. But now on to more serious matters. Code containing security issues. Security issues are super important also, of course, from a GDPR and data protection perspective. So let's see, most software systems nowadays handle data. If we go to the next slide, please. I've come up with a very simple problem, very common actually. Most software systems have some form of database where they store some data, quite often emails as well. In this case, in the example, MySQL, it's a very well-known open source database system. And I've asked in green in a comment to generate me a function that deletes an email from a table called emails using the MySQL technology, and in this case, using the C programming language. So if we go to the next slide, we will see that this is the output from Copilot. It is valid C code, but there's actually a couple of issues with them. There's at least two. If you're a bit tech savvy or you're in this space, you probably will recognize the SQL injection, meaning that if you put in an email address, it will probably work. But if you have more nefarious intentions, you could actually wreak havoc on the system. For example, if you would close the quote, you would end the statement and actually say drop table email, which actually is a SQL lingo from remove the whole table, which is obviously not what you want if you just wanted to remove a single email address. But wait, there's more, as they tend to say. You see, or maybe not, please, one second. Could we go back? We've allocated a little bit of space for this instruction to the database server. But if I now put in a very long input, I actually might corrupt the memory that was allocated. So I could go over its boundaries. That's called a buffer overflow. And it's a very well-known attack vector to compromise systems, or to crash them, or to gain entry, etc. So maybe it was me, maybe I was a bit naive. So let's see whether we can do better. So if we can go to the next slide. So let's see if we can specifically instruct Copilot not to be vulnerable. I could imagine that if I'm an experienced developer, say, okay, yeah, I need to be aware. I know that these systems are not perfect. So let's do that. So I've asked it, generate me a function that deletes an email from a table called emails using MySQL that isn't suffering from SQL injection. Well, definitely it generated a different function, but unfortunately, it still has the SQL injection, but it also still has the buffer overflow. So what does that mean? It means that even though I might have gained some speed during development, I've actually, and if I'm not aware of these kind of issues, especially if there are multiple, you might think you're a smart guy and found one of the issues. There may be multiple. So you need to make sure that you have the proper guardrails in place to catch these kind of issues in your code, review, tests, etc. So let's go to another example, which might have very far-reaching societal effects. I will take over the screen from a previous share video. And as you might recall, this is the case where code contains a racial bias. I will just wait for a second for the screen to settle. Yeah, here we go. A bit of code for generating statements on policies. In this case, generate statement on topic. And there's a kind of casual headline at the top saying that this is a headline generator for the US Republican Party. For the sake of demonstration, I made it a bit more obvious, putting in skin color as parameters. But as you will see, when it's generating the code, there's some things that are to be seen here. So if my skin color equals white and their skin color equals black, it says we are the party of freedom. Here, what you see, for example, if my skin color equals white, we don't want their skin color people to have something. Well, there's more examples that it generated, but what you can already see, and it's very easy to also, like we had in the PDF example, to come up with more and more of these kinds of solutions. Pretty much any and all of them had these issues. Funnily enough, if you change the comment at the top for the Democratic Party, you would get well, depending on your political view, a more nuanced view. But this is clearly very undesirable from let's say, at first sight perspective. But imagine that these systems would be used in a decision support system. Obviously, the bias would be in there. But maybe even worse, if such code would be used in systems that process data that would train new AI systems, then these biases might run the risk of multiplying and amplifying biases, and especially in complex systems, they're super hard to detect. Now, quickly on to the last example, and then before I hand over to the legal team, 1 second, please. Here we go. This is a very quick example. Again, in the C programming language, I've created a bit of code calculating the distance from Earth of various planets. Please forgive me that Pluto is also in there. Copilot became a bit cheeky when I generated the first time. It didn't include Pluto. Say, hey, where's Pluto? Say, well, Pluto is a protoplanet, so that's why I didn't include it. It's here, so don't worry. But let's see how it goes. There's a new plugin called Copilot Labs. It's apparently still in beta, but you can select a bit of code with the various planets. And let's hit that button there on the left. Go to language translation. And let's say I found this bit of C code in a drawer, and my project is using Python. I see here on the left, translate code into Python, and let's see what it comes up with. Well, it apparently already has generated it for me, so I don't even have to ask. I didn't test that code, but to me, it looks quite a lot like Python code. Yeah, could work with that. So what I showed here was a bit of C code, distance from the planet, cross-translating into a different language. Now, I'm super curious what the legal team has to say about these 4 examples. Over to you.
Thank you, Brecht. Super interesting examples. Well, if we look at Copilot's user terms, we see some interesting things there. And it's not a coincidence that part of these terms are very comparable to the ChatGPT terms. However, there are some differences. I will not read all those clauses out loud. We will get to the summary later on. Maybe we can move to the next one already. That basically highlights the important parts of their privacy statement. And if we move to the next slide, we see the summary here of the clauses that we just depicted, and that is that users retain all rights to both their input and their output. So that is nice to know. And Copilot states that it will not store code snippets, and that these snippets are discarded once a suggestion is returned. So that is different actually from ChatGPT, because ChatGPT doesn't make such a distinction. However, Copilot AI does state that it will use users information when you are interacting with the system. From a legal point of view, it is not always, and also from a practical point of view, it is not always clear what the boundaries are of code snippets and what the boundaries are of users information. So basically we see here that Copilot AI is also deriving your data when you're using the system to improve their models. And we don't know exactly what they will do with it afterwards. We can move to the next slide. Well, if we go to the specific examples that we just saw, if we look at example 1, where Brecht showed that you can generate code from human readable text, where he asked the system to create a beautiful PDF with a very spicy line, that is probably okay. From an IP perspective, we see no issues here, and also from other taking into account our legislation, this is a low risk application or low risk use. If we go to example 2, Brecht asked Copilot, generate code for me that does this and that. And afterward, he specifically asked the system, oh, please do not make it vulnerable. And still there were some security issues. From an IP angle, this is probably okay because we weren't using anybody else's code. But liability-wise, well, you can already predict that this is not okay, and that you should, well, be very careful when relying on Copilot AI when you are developing code for a client or when you want to use that code for specific applications. Example 3, well, as you might expect, that is not okay for various reasons, not only for ethical reasons, but the use of such a system would in any case violate GDPR. Unless very, very specific circumstances apply, by no means you are allowed to process data regarding skin color, and decision-making on the basis of skin color is, well, I don't think that would be allowed under any means. Another reason why this code would be forbidden and the use thereof is the proposal for the AI Act, and that is European law that we will discuss later on. Example 4, that is a bit more simple. We saw a translation of somebody else's code that would probably acquire authorization of the owner of the code if it's not your own. An important side note here, for example, if you use code that is made available under an MIT license that is basically restriction-free, you can also derive your authorization from that sort of specific restriction-free license. So that is, I think, relevant information. If we move to the next slide, we see an overview of legislation to come, which is the proposal for an AI Act. This AI Act is very elaborate, but a very important aspect of this AI Act is that it basically distinguishes AI applications in 4 categories, varying from absolutely prohibited to low risk. Well, prohibited is prohibited, so that is by no means allowed to use. The code with the racial bias would absolutely fall within that category. But as you can see, there is also a category that is not forbidden, but is considered high risk. And basically, the more risky a certain AI tool will be, the more requirements will be applicable for both the users, the providers, and the developers. And in short, if you violate these obligations, don't comply with that, GDPR-like fines will be or can be imposed if this proposal for the AI Act becomes effective. And GDPR-like fines, I mean like high fines that could end up into millions. So that is important information. Next slide, please. A question that is often asked at our team members or at parties where people discuss these new tools offered by OpenAI, is what they're doing actually legal? Because we just discussed that the temporary reproduction of somebody else's code is a restricted act and that you would basically need authorization. So taking into account that Copilot and ChatGPT are trained on somebody else's code for a large part, isn't that legal? Wouldn't that be piracy or copyright infringement? A bunch of people in the US say that it is, and they have filed a class action lawsuit. That is a very interesting fact. And if we move to the next slide, yes. It is interesting to note that it's not a coincidence that this class action was filed in the US, because in the EU, a specific data mining, text and data mining exception applies when you want to train your AI models. And this exception was included in the DSM directive, basically because there was a strong lobby for this from the AI sector. Rights holders can opt out, so they can basically put a reference in their code that says, I do not want my code to be processed by artificial intelligence. Another requirement is that this text and data mining exception will only apply if you can lawfully access the code. But if we look at this GitHub Copilot case, it is quite likely that in the EU, but not sure yet, but quite likely that Copilot will be able to rely on the text and data mining exception. In the US, there's a whole different game, and there the rule is that one must assess whether Copilot or OpenAI can rely on the fair use exception, and that is, well, it's another test basically. If we move to the next slide, we see some future developments here that could be relevant. If in the US it is ruled that what OpenAI does qualifies as fair use, probably the AI sector will flourish more in the US than in the EU, because if it's fair use, you cannot opt out. It is considered fair use to use other people's code to train your model. But in the EU, although we have this text and data mining exception, software developers can opt out. So that would be very interesting. On the other hand, if the US court would rule that OpenAI could not rely on fair use, the EU AI sector would flourish more because there would be more freedom here. So it's very interesting what the outcome will be of the US court case.
Thanks, Laura. I think that Brecht will just summarize.
Yes,
learning.
next slide. Yeah,
Yes,
over
learning.
to you, Brecht.
Excellent. I will just keep it quite brief. There's a lot we can say about this, but some key points that I would like to share with all of you. The key takeaway from our experience with these tools is that while they're definitely not perfect, and we've seen some pretty imperfect cases and with definite caveats, we believe it's a transformative technology that will change the way we create and even perhaps think about creating technology for good. Some key points. As we saw in Stepan's case, these tools can significantly speed up the coding process. If you provide it, you ask the right question and the tool is actually performing quite well. Similarly, while not 100% accurate, Copilot or ChatGPT can help you improve your code quality by, for example, explaining the code or generating test cases, these chores, as Stepan already mentioned. As we saw in the example of insecure code, these tools are definitely not a replacement for human expertise. While the tools can be helpful, it's important to remember that they are just that, a tool. Make sure you have proper guardrails in place in your process, your tooling, in perhaps your legal frameworks when you start embarking on such a journey. Of course, while the results we see at the moment are already quite impressive, the technology is still in its infancy and it's constantly improving as we go along. So I guess we can expect to see many new features and improvements as they go along. Yeah, so in fact, the answer to the question, should I use this for my team, is, as so often, it depends. You may encounter, as we saw, situations where the tool doesn't provide useful suggestions or plainly wrong code, or it appears to be acting plain dumb. It's important to be aware of all these limitations and to make sure that you use your own judgment, you as a professional, but also as a team and as a business, to decide whether you can use the tool and a suggestion, and in which cases it may work and may not. Laura, I would like to, we have one more topic on GDPR. I would like to hand over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, there is, and it's basically, it's actually quite funny that we mentioned it only in one slide, because a huge one more thing is GDPR compliance. And this issue should raise lots of caution signs in your mind. You must be aware that if you connect with these tools, that a lot of GDPR risks will arise, and that also the use of OpenAI, of all the data that we put in these tools, probably violates the GDPR. And well, to keep it at high level, there are 5 principles of the GDPR, and these are data minimization, data security, etc. They are summed up at the bottom left of the slide. And basically we see that both the use and the providing of these tools is hard to align with these principles. For example, if we take data minimization, these tools provided by OpenAI, they thrive by processing huge amounts of data. And you can, of course, entry also personal data in there, and you don't really know what OpenAI will do with it afterwards. They only say that they will improve their models with it, but, well, data minimization is not complied with. The same applies to fairness and transparency. It's quite vague what they will do with the data. Data security will be an issue. Brecht just showed how vulnerable the code can be that Copilot generates. So lots of red flags here. And well, to conclude with a final remark, also be aware that you might accidentally be sharing data while using the systems. Lots of data do not feel as personal data, but can still be online identifiers. But also if you load a CSV file in your editor, this might be accessible for Copilot. We're not sure because they're quite vague about the way how they use our data. I think we can move to the next slide now.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think we are almost there. We're almost by the end of the webinar today. So that was very insightful. We have a few questions from the audience. I think they are all in the questions tab. Laura, can you try to answer Edwin's questions?
Yes, let me see. The output answer is 100% related to the input. The quality of the answer is highly dependent on the quality of the question. Could it be that the question asked is so unique that even the generated answer is also unique, and therefore IP is possible? Super cool question, because in theory that could be the case. And this is basically the argument that David Slater put forward, that these monkeys could never have taken these pictures of themselves without his human interference. So yes, theoretically, that is correct.
If I may, because there are some technical quirks to that. It might be depending on, I think, interpretation, but let's leave it. There is technical thing that you currently cannot. I think it is extremely hard to generate the same output with the same input. Like if you even play with ChatGPT and you paste the same input a few times, it always generates something different. So
yeah, but I don't think that would affect it. That probably is relevant for the question of Ruben that says, how will they know that I use ChatGPT? That makes it very hard to tell. But I think within the perspective whether or not the machine-generated output could, in theory, qualify for copyright protection, it doesn't. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, that if ChatGPT will always generate a different answer, then the human involvement is by any means too limited to qualify. Yeah, that's also an interesting argument. But I would say from a legal perspective, because it's all new, it's unlikely that any machine-generated output would qualify for copyright protection, but theoretically not impossible.
Yes, and there is also a very neat thing about recognizing output from ChatGPT. For now, it actually is not possible because even at exams, they are feeding questions to ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is like getting lawyer degree or something.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also a problem for AI researchers itself, because they don't want to train their models on output of AI. So I noticed there are some research to be done how to mark those texts in a way that further AI models will be able to recognize it. But I'm not sure how they will do it, but they're working on it.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah.
Okay, then we have another question from Daniel. He asked, what happens if somebody inputs my code or other copyright items to the chat without my authorization? Sure, he broke the law, but what can I do about it if the thing already flies in your database?
Yes, true. What in theory you could do is impose or ask a court if you can substantiate all this, and if you can prove that you are the copyright owner and somebody did this, you can ask an injunction for the person who uploaded it in ChatGPT to never do that again, subject to a penalty. And I think it would be logical to also file a claim against OpenAI and ask them to remove your reproductions of your code from their systems. And probably they will say that is not possible. And then we will end up in a new discussion about what you can realistically ask and whether it's their problem, whether they cannot delete it, or your problem. But it's true that, and that is basically the same with, for example, if personal data or sensitive information about a company becomes available, yeah, you can go to court, but the damage is already done.
Yeah. Thanks. And then we have another question from Adam. He asked, so you can use generated code by ChatGPT to build his SaaS startup, but what if the owners or the investors find it important that you own the full IP of the software?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that in this aspect, that a relevant question in due diligence transactions will be that usually you have to be transparent about open source components used in your software. And I think now you will have to be transparent about which part of your software were machine generated. I think that's going to be a new question when possible investors or possible buyers want to assess the worth of your company and your software in particular.
Yeah, thanks. And then I guess the last question, because we're already running out of time with almost 10 minutes. It's a question from Gaston. His CEO really wants to move forward and pilot with AI in customer service. And what is your advice on the first steps in this?
Yeah, I would be transparent here and explain to the customer that all the upsides of the use thereof, but well, the customer must be aware that if it's the customer's code, that he uses a certain amount of, he loses control of certain code when you use these tools. So you have to be very transparent here. And I don't think it will be suitable for all cases. Maybe when it's really standard code and people ask standard questions like, oh, just build me a nice website or make me an application, and I don't really care if somebody else would be able to use that code. Perhaps it's very useful. But for more innovative code, I think the customers will be not so enthusiastic.
All right. All right. Not sure if that's the complete answer to Gaston's question.
No?
But I'm Gaston, so I will. Well, I admit this could also be answered from technical perspective. But I will.
Or in customer service, you mean like as a chatbot, for example?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, always be transparent, because that is already on the basis of other legal obligations. Persons need to be aware that they're chatting with a robot and not with a human. So transparency would be my first advice again.
All right. But I also reach out to you, Gaston, to maybe talk about the technical perspective of your question. So thanks a lot. That brings us to the end of our webinar. Big thanks to all the speakers, and thank you for all the many people who are participating in here and all the great questions, actually. In the next stage, we'll receive our white paper. We're still polishing it up a little bit. We wanted to keep some space to add some answers to questions or some feedback that we got. And also we're trying to work in the new changes that ChatGPT-4 that was released last week actually brought. So we're finishing that. You might expect it in 1 or 2 days. There will be a live recording of this webinar immediately live actually after this event on the landing page where you actually went to today. And we will also share the link to this webinar in the white paper and on our socials. So thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. Have a great evening. And we really hope that you found this all very insightful. So thank you a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Leo. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.